The final nail in Thomas's coffin was also the final nail in Ilara's life, in the town of Prosperity Gulch. 2 days after the dirt was patted down on his grave, her father-in-law, Mr. Gable, called her into the back office of his mercantile. The room smelled of ledger ink, oiled leather, and a cold finality that mirrored the November sky outside. Mr. Gable did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his heavy oak desk, a fortress of commerce and judgment, and slid a small leather pouch and a folded piece of paper across the polished surface. "This is what's left of Thomas's share," he said, his voice as dry as winter dust. "After debts, after the funeral expenses." The pouch landed with a soft, pathetic clink. It was not the sound of a future, it was the sound of an ending. Ilara looked at it, then at the paper. It was the deed to a patch of land northwest of town, a place Thomas had inherited from his own grandfather and had always called with a grim laugh, the Stone Folly. "The house belongs to the business," Mr. Gable continued, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "You and the children will need to be out by morning. It's not proper for you to remain." The injustice of it was a physical blow, a silent theft of air from her lungs. This was the house she had made a home, where her son, Leo, had taken his first steps, where her daughter, Cora, had been born. This was the man whose son she had loved, nursed through his final sickness, and buried. Now he was erasing her and the 2 small pieces of his son she had left. She said nothing. Arguing with Mr. Gable was like arguing with a granite cliff. Instead, she picked up the pouch. It held $7. She picked up the deed, its paper brittle and thin. This was her inheritance, $7 and a piece of land universally considered worthless. A wind-swept hill of broken rock and stunted juniper that couldn't grow a crop or graze a single cow. It was a place people pointed to as an example of God's disinterest. She walked out of the mercantile, the bell over the door tinkling a cheerful, mocking goodbye. The eyes of the town were on her. She saw pity in some, a cold satisfaction in others. Brant, the trapper, was leaning against a post, whittling a stick. He caught her eye and gave a slow, knowing shake of his head, a gesture that said plainly, "You're done for." She ignored him. She ignored them all. She went back to the house that was no longer hers and packed. There wasn't much. A few worn blankets, a cast-iron skillet, Thomas's axe, a bag of flour, and the clothes they wore. Leo, at 6 years old, understood enough to be silent and watchful. Cora, only 4, cried, not knowing why they were leaving, but feeling the chill of it in her bones. Ilara knelt and looked her children in the eyes. Her own grief was a heavy stone in her chest, but it would have to wait. It was a luxury she could not afford. "We're going on an adventure," she said, her voice steady, a lie that had to become the truth. "We're going to build our own castle." Before leaving Prosperity Gulch for the last time, she made one stop. She walked back into Gable's mercantile, the bell announcing her like a ghost. She ignored her father-in-law's glare and placed 3 of her $7 on the counter. "I need a good saw," she said, "and a bag of salt, and 10 pounds of nails." The transaction was silent. He gave her the goods, taking the coins without a word. As she turned to leave, he spoke, his voice low. "There is charity, Ilara. The church has a room." She stopped but did not turn around. "We will not be a burden." She pushed the door open and walked out, her children clinging to her skirt, their loyal dog Buster trotting silently at her heel. She turned her back on the town, on the life she had known, and began the long walk toward the Folly. She did not look back. The journey was a punishment. The late autumn wind had teeth, and it tore at their thin coats. The 4 miles to the property were all uphill, on a track that was more a rumor than a road. Leo, trying to be brave, carried the small sack of flour until his arms trembled. Ilara carried Cora on one hip and the heavy saw and axe in her other hand. Buster ranged ahead, his nose to the ground, the only member of their small party who seemed to have any confidence in the direction they were headed. By the time they reached the marker stone that designated the edge of her property, the sun was a pale, watery disk sinking behind the mountains, and she saw it. The Stone Folly. It was worse than she remembered. A desolate slope of gray, lichen-spotted boulders, some as large as wagons, jumbled together in ancient chaos. Above the field of rock was a low cliff face, perhaps 20 feet high, with a wide, shallow alcove gouged into it by millennia of wind. It was not a cave. It was barely a dent. This was her land. This was their castle. The cold dread that had been nipping at her heels all day finally sank its teeth deep into her heart. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. Brant was right. This was a place to die, not to live. She sank to her knees, the weight of the saw, the children, and the utter hopelessness of it all crushing her. Tears she had refused to shed in town burned hot in her eyes. For a single, terrifying moment, she believed they were doomed. Leo huddled against her, his small body shivering. Buster whined, pressing his cold nose into her hand. Then the wind rose, a physical force that screamed over the rocks. It hit them like a hammer, stealing their breath. Instinctively, Alara gathered the children and scrambled into the shallow alcove, pressing them against the back wall of stone. She pulled a blanket over them, her own body a shield against the biting cold. And then she felt it. A stillness. Outside the alcove, the wind howled like a banshee, whipping loose dirt and dry leaves into a frenzy. But inside, where they huddled, the air was almost completely calm. The immense, chaotic pile of boulders in front of them was acting as a massive windbreak, disrupting the flow of the gale before it could reach the cliff face. She pressed her bare hand against the rock wall behind her. It was cold, of course, but it was a dry, solid cold, not the damp, life-leeching cold of the earth. She shuffled deeper into a fissure at the back of the space, pulling the children with her. And then she heard it, a faint, impossibly steady sound beneath the shriek of the wind, drip, drip, drip. She felt her way along the fissure in the near darkness. Her fingers found dampness, then a tiny, constant trickle of water weeping from the stone. She touched a finger to her lips. It was clean, and it was not frozen. It was cool, but not icy. As she stayed pressed against the deep rock, another sensation registered, so subtle she almost dismissed it. A warmth. It was not heat, but an absence of the bitter cold. A faint, persistent energy radiating from deep within the stone itself. Geothermal warmth. The heart of the mountain was alive. Despair did not vanish. It was beaten back by a new feeling, something fierce and grim. Resolve. The town saw a worthless pile of rocks. She saw a wall. They saw a useless cliff. She saw a roof and two sides of a house already built. They saw a barren, wind-swept waste. She felt a hidden warmth, a secret spring, and the one thing she needed more than anything else, a chance. This place was not a tomb. It was a foundation. The first week was brutal. Ilara worked from the gray light of dawn until her muscles screamed in the frigid twilight. Their only shelter was the alcove itself, with a fire burning constantly at its mouth. She taught Leo how to feed the fire, to never let it die. Her first task was to enclose the space, to turn the alcove into a room. The field of fallen boulders was her quarry. She had no levers, no block, and tackle. She had only her own body, Thomas's axe for a wedge, and a desperate ingenuity. She found smaller, manageable stones and began to lay the first course of a wall across the mouth of the alcove. She lifted until her back seized, and her hands, raw and soft from a life indoors, blistered, broke, and bled. She ignored the pain. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept working. The children watched, their faces pale in the firelight. They helped by gathering twigs and dragging smaller stones. Buster proved his worth a dozen times over. He was their guardian. One night, his low growl alerted her to a pair of glowing eyes at the edge of the firelight. A coyote. She threw a burning branch, and it vanished into the darkness. He was their hunter, too, returning once with a rabbit that gave them their first real meal in days. He was their warmth, curling up with the children under the thin blankets. Her greatest challenge was moving the larger stones. She learned to use gravity, rolling them downhill. She learned to use leverage, jamming the handle of the axe into crevices to pry them loose. Day by day the wall grew. It was not pretty. It was a rough, ugly thing of mismatched rocks, but it was solid. She left a gap for a door and 2 small openings for windows. With the stone shell in place, she turned to the forest. The stunted pines that grew on the lee side of the hill were her only source of timber. Felling the first tree was a lesson in humility. The saw was heavy and awkward. Her arms ached with a fire that eclipsed the pain in her hands. But when the tree finally groaned and crashed to the ground, the victory was immense. It was a tangible thing. It was a roof beam. She spent 2 weeks felling, trimming, and hauling logs. She was no longer a widow. She was a beast of burden. She dragged the logs one by one to her construction site, Buster sometimes tugging alongside her on a rope, barking with what sounded like encouragement. She laid them across the top of her stone walls to the cliff face, forming the framework for a roof. Mortar was the next problem. She found a deposit of heavy clay near the seep. She spent days digging it out with her hands and the skillet, mixing it with water and dried grass to give it body. Then came the painstaking work of chinking, of filling every single gap in her stone wall with the thick, sticky mixture. It was cold, miserable work. The clay sucked the warmth from her fingers, leaving them numb and white. But as the gaps disappeared, so did the drafts. The space inside began to feel less like a cave and more like a room. Her most ingenious creation was the chimney. She noticed a wider fissure that ran up the cliff face from inside the alcove. Using a piece of sharp stone, she painstakingly widened the opening at the bottom, building a hearth of flat rocks around it. The natural fissure acted as a perfect flue, drawing the smoke up and away. The first time she lit a fire inside the now enclosed space, she held her breath. The smoke hesitated for a moment, then obediently curled upwards and vanished into the rock. It worked. For the first time since leaving town, Ilara wept, not from despair, but from a bone-deep, weary triumph. The water seep became her next focus. She followed the trickle and realized it emerged from the rock about 3 feet off the ground. Using her axe and a stone hammer, she carefully chipped away at the floor beneath it, digging a shallow basin. She lined the entire basin with a thick layer of her clay, packing it down until it was smooth and waterproof. The seep filled it slowly, creating a small, clean cistern of fresh water inside her home. They would not need to melt snow. They would not need to brave the wind to drink. Before the first heavy snows arrived, she knew she had to risk a trip back to town. She had built a shell, but they needed more to survive the winter. They needed livestock. Leaving Leo in charge of the fire, with Buster as his guard, she took Cora and the $4 she had left and walked the long miles back to Prosperity Gulch. The town was a shock. It felt loud, crowded, and fragile. People stared as she walked down the main street, a wild woman with calloused hands and a face chapped raw by the wind. She went straight to the mercantile. Mr. Gable was behind the counter. He looked at her, then at his granddaughter, and for a moment a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossed his face. It vanished as quickly as it came. "Come for charity now, have you?" he asked quietly, so the other customers wouldn't hear. "I've come to trade," she said, her voice clear and strong. She placed her last $4 on the counter. "I need 2 laying hens, a young goat, 1 in milk, if you have it, and seeds, turnip, carrot, and kale, and another bag of salt." He stared at her as if she were mad. A goat? Up at the Folly? It'll freeze solid in a week. What are you going to feed it?" "That's my concern," she said. The transaction was a spectacle. The whole town seemed to watch as she led a bleating goat and carried a crate with 2 clucking chickens out of the mercantile. Brant the trapper was there again, this time with a friend. He didn't even try to hide his laughter. "Look at that," he boomed, gesturing with his thumb. "The cave girl is starting a farm, probably going to plant those seeds in a pile of rocks." His friend guffawed. The nickname stuck. From that day on, she was the cave girl, and her children were the folly girls, a cruel joke that ignored Leo's existence entirely. The journey back was even harder, coaxing a stubborn goat up the rocky path. But when she arrived, Leo had kept the fire burning. They brought the animals into a small, heavily insulated lean-to she had built against the warmest part of the rock wall, a space that shared a wall with their living quarters. The goat, which Cora named Daisy, and the chickens seemed to sense the security of the place and settled in quickly. Her final project was the most hopeful. Against the back wall of their home, the one that radiated the constant, gentle warmth, she built 3 long, shallow boxes out of scrap wood. She spent a week hauling soil from a sheltered pocket on the hillside, bucket by bucket, filling the boxes. It was back-breaking, tedious work. In this rich, dark soil, under the faint, steady warmth of the geothermal rock, she planted her seeds, a subterranean garden hidden from the winter. It was a defiant act of faith. By the time the first real blizzard hit, their world was sealed. She had fashioned a heavy door from split logs, insulated with packed moss and clay. The window openings were covered with scraped goat hide, treated with fat to make them translucent. It let in a dim, milky light. Their home was dark, smelling of damp earth, wood smoke, and animals. But it was warm. As winter deepened, a routine took hold. Life shrank to the rhythms of survival. Each morning began with tending the fire, adding a single, slow-burning log. Then she would milk Daisy, the warm, frothy milk, a daily miracle. She would check on the chickens, their 2 daily eggs a treasure beyond price. She watered her garden boxes, watching with a fierce pride as the first green shoots of kale and turnip tops pushed through the soil. The world outside ceased to exist. The wind could scream, the snow could pile up in drifts as high as the roof, but inside their stone fortress there was calm. The massive rock walls absorbed the cold. The geothermal heat from the back wall was a constant, silent furnace. Her small fire was needed more for cooking and cheer than for primary heat. Leo and Cora, who had been pale and frightened, grew robust. They had milk to drink, eggs to eat, and a warm floor to play on. Their world was one room, but it was a safe one. The mockery of the town faded into a distant memory. The nickname Cave Girl lost its sting. She was not a girl, and this was not a cave. It was a home, built not just with stone and clay, but with a will that had refused to break. There were small tests. One night, a pack of wolves, driven by hunger, circled their home. Their howls were terrifying, but the walls were stone. Buster's furious barking from within was the only reply they received. They eventually moved on. Another time, a week of heavy, wet snow caused a section of the lean-to roof to sag. She spent a whole day in the biting cold, reinforcing it, her muscles burning, her resolve hardening with every swing of the axe. Brant, the trapper, made one more visit before the deep freeze set in. He was checking his lines and stopped, more out of curiosity than concern. He saw the smoke curling from the fissure in the cliff and shook his head. "You're building a tomb, woman," he called out, his voice full of rugged certainty. "Mark my words, that rock will suck the life right out of you. Come the deep freeze, you and those little ones will be blocks of ice. It's the damp that'll kill you." Ilara was chinking a final gap near the door. She didn't look at him. "We're fine," she said. "Fine for now," he scoffed. "But you haven't seen a real winter in these parts. It's not the snow that gets you. It's the cold that comes after. the still, silent cold that cracks trees. You can't fight that with a little fire and a pile of rocks. He laughed and walked away, disappearing into the gray woods. His words lingered in the air, a final prophecy of doom. Then, in the first week of January, the world changed. The snow stopped. The wind died. A profound, unnatural stillness fell over the land. The sky cleared to a brilliant crystalline blue that offered no warmth. This was the cold Brant had spoken of. The great blizzard of '83 was not a storm of snow, but a storm of pure cold. The temperature plummeted, and it did not rise again for 3 weeks. It was a cold that was a physical entity, a predator. It seeped through log walls, crept under doors, and shattered windows. It was a cold that killed. In Prosperity Gulch, the community's confidence shattered with the freezing temperatures. The log cabins and frame houses, built with the pride of convention, began to fail. Wood contracted in the extreme cold, opening up gaps in the chinking. Nails popped with sounds like pistol shots in the night. The heat from their fireplaces went straight up their chimneys, while the Arctic air poured in through 100 tiny cracks. Families burned through their wood piles at a terrifying rate, the fires roaring day and night, just to keep the frost from forming on the inside of the walls. Livestock, even in their barns, began to freeze to death. The town well froze solid, forcing people to risk the open ice of the creek. Roofs, burdened by the earlier heavy snow, groaned and in some cases collapsed. The town, which had felt so secure, so permanent, was revealed to be a fragile collection of wooden boxes, helpless against the true power of winter. Mr. Gable's mercantile, built tighter than most, became a refuge for a few, but he couldn't save everyone. Prosperity Gulch was freezing, slowly and inexorably. But inside the folly, life went on. Ilara's home, once a symbol of foolish desperation, was now an island of impossible warmth and stability. The deep geothermal heat from the rock wall radiated its gentle, constant warmth day and night. The massive stone walls, with their feet of thickness, were impervious to the cold. The wind had no purchase on them. Her small, efficient fire needed only a few logs a day to keep the single room comfortable. The contrast was staggering. Outside, the trees cracked like gunshots in the frozen air. Inside, the seep water trickled into their cistern, unfrozen. Outside, the world was a crystalline desert of white and blue, hostile to all life. Inside her subterranean garden was a line of impossible green. The kale was thriving. The turnips were swelling in their beds. The chickens clucked softly in their insulated lean-to. The goat chewed her cud placidly. The animals were warm, the water still flowed, and the food grew. Ilara was not fighting the cold. She was living outside its reach. Her children, unaware of the crisis gripping the valley below, were not just surviving, they were thriving. They played games on the earthen floor, their laughter echoing softly in the warm, dim space. They were warm, well-fed, and safe. The folly was no tomb, it was an ark. One afternoon during the second week of the freeze, Buster began to bark. It was not his warning growl for a wolf, but a frantic, insistent sound directed at the door. Ilara quieted him, her hand on his ruff, and listened. Over the profound silence of the frozen world, she heard a sound, a desperate, rhythmic banging. Someone was outside. She pulled back the heavy bar on the door and opened it a crack. The cold that flooded in was so intense it felt like a physical blow. A figure, completely covered in snow and ice, stood there, swaying. The figure raised a hand, then collapsed forward into the doorway. It was a man. With Buster's help, she dragged him inside and pushed the heavy door shut, barring it against the lethal cold. She brushed the snow from his face. It was Brant, the trapper. His skin was a waxy, dead white. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His eyes were barely open, the pupils tiny and dark. He was in the final stages of freezing to death. He, the expert, the man who understood the wilderness, had been defeated by it. She saw not the man who had mocked her, but a human being on the edge of extinction. The memory of his cruel laughter, of the nickname Cave Girl, flashed in her mind. It would be so easy to let him lie there. It would be justice of a kind. But then she looked at her children, their faces full of fear and concern, and she knew she couldn't. That was the kind of justice that belonged to the town she had left behind. Working quickly, she cut away his frozen coat. She rubbed his hands and feet with snow, the old way, to bring the feeling back slowly and prevent the tissue from dying. She wrapped him in their warmest blankets and propped him near the hearth, but not too near. She heated goat's milk and spooned the warm liquid between his cracked lips. For an hour he was unresponsive. Then a shudder ran through his body. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. His eyes fluttered open and focused on her face. He tried to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. "My chimney," he managed. "Cracked. Fire went out. Wood, all gone." He told her of the state of the town, of the sickness, the fear, the dwindling supplies. He spoke of the preacher's son, a boy the same age as Leo, who was down with a lung fever and shivering in a cabin that was barely warmer than the air outside. He had been trying to get to a stand of deadfall timber on the far side of the ridge when the cold finally overcame him. He had seen the faint wisp of smoke from her chimney and had stumbled towards it as his last hope. As the warmth seeped back into his bones, Brant began to take in his surroundings. His gaze moved from the steady fire to the stone walls, to the trickling water in the cistern. He saw the chickens in their enclosure. Then his eyes fell upon the garden boxes against the back wall, with their rows of healthy green plants. He stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the sight with the dead, frozen world outside. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the stone wall behind him. He felt it. The impossible, steady warmth. He looked at Alara, then at Leo and Cora, who were watching him with wide, curious eyes from the far side of the room, playing quietly with carved wooden animals. They wore simple woolen clothes, their cheeks pink with health. They were not shivering, they were not hungry, they were not afraid. The trapper's arrogance, his lifetime of self-assured knowledge, crumbled into dust. Everything he thought he knew about survival was wrong. Everything he had mocked, everything he had dismissed as foolishness, was the very thing that had saved him. His eyes filled with tears which froze instantly on his raw cheeks. "I called you a fool," he rasped, his voice thick with shame. He shook his head slowly, in utter disbelief. "My God, we were the fools, all of us." Alara's response was not a word. It was an action. She ladled broth from a pot simmering over the fire and handed the bowl to him. Her face was calm, unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, profound grace. "There is food," she said simply. "Eat." He ate, and with every spoonful his shame deepened. He had come to her land to mock. He had left predicting her death. Now he was taking her food, warmed by her fire, sheltered by her wisdom. The next day, when he was strong enough to stand, Alara was already preparing. She had packed a small sled she had made from saplings and rawhide. On it were 3 of their precious logs, a bundle of blankets, a jar of preserved berries, and a skin of goat's milk. "This is for the preacher's family," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "The boy." Brant stared at the sled, then at her. He, who had offered her nothing but scorn, was now witnessing a generosity that was as inexplicable to him as the warmth in her walls. He had nothing to offer in return. He had been stripped of everything, most of all his pride. "I'll take it," he said, his voice quiet. "I'll show you the way." The freeze broke 3 days later. The temperature rose, and the great silence was broken by the sound of dripping water. The survivors of Prosperity Gulch emerged from their homes like bears from hibernation, blinking in the weak sunlight. The story Brant told spread through the town like wildfire. He told them of the stone house, of the running water, of the green things growing in the dead of winter. He told them of the warm, healthy children and the woman who had saved his life without a single word of reproach. No one believed him at first. It sounded like a fever dream. But they had seen him stumble out of the wilderness, more dead than alive. And they had seen the sled of supplies he brought to the preacher's house, supplies that had helped the small boy turn a corner. So they went to see for themselves. At first it was just a few, then more. A small, silent pilgrimage made its way up the trail to the stone folly. They stood before her home, staring at the rough stone wall and the wisp of smoke rising from the cliff face. They saw the healthy goat peering out of its enclosure. Ilara let them look. She stood in her doorway, her children beside her, and watched the faces of the people who had pitied and scorned her. She saw their skepticism curdle into shock and then into a deep, humbled awe. The derisive nickname was the first thing to die. No one called her the cave girl again. The place was no longer the stone folly. People began to call it the hearth, for the impossible warmth it had held when the rest of their world had frozen. One day, Mr. Gable made the journey. He walked alone, his steps heavy. He stood before the home his daughter-in-law had built from his scorn and his scraps. He saw his grandchildren, Leo and Cora, playing by the door. They were healthy, strong, and they looked at him as if he were a stranger. He looked at Ilara, at her capable hands and her quiet, steady eyes, and the full weight of his actions fell upon him. "You should come back," he said, his voice strained. "The house is empty. It's yours." Ilara shook her head, a small, simple gesture. "Thank you, Mr. Gable," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice. "But this is our home now." He turned and walked away, a diminished man. He had offered her a place in his world, but she had already built her own, and it was stronger. The blizzard of '83 became a line in the sand, a story told for generations, and at the center of that story was the widow who had been cast out. Her methods, once seen as madness, became local wisdom. New settlers built their cabins nestled against hillsides, incorporating massive stone hearths that held the heat. Building like the widow became a local phrase, a term of high praise for anyone who built with foresight and resilience. Her home became a landmark, a testament to the idea that what one person discards as worthless, another can use as a cornerstone. Years passed. The children grew. The hearth expanded. Ilara, with the help of a humbled Brant and other neighbors, added another room, a bigger barn, a stone-walled garden that flourished in the summer sun. She never remarried. She had no need. Her life was full, built on a foundation of her own making. She traded her surplus vegetables, goat cheese, and chickens for things she couldn't make, becoming a quiet, respected pillar of the community that had once cast her out. She lived a long life, long enough to see her own grandchildren play on the warm stone floor of the home she had raised from the rubble. On clear evenings, she would sit outside her door and place her hand on the wall. The stone was still warm, still radiating the deep, secret life of the earth. It had been her salvation, the silent partner in her survival. The world had given her nothing but a pile of rocks, and from it she had built not just a shelter, but a legacy, a quiet, enduring testament to the simple, unshakable power of a will that refused to be broken.